The year is 792 at Samye Monastery, which is Tibet's oldest monastery. The Tibetan king, Trisong Detsen, who was one of the first Tibetan kings to sort of really bring Buddhism to Tibet in a big way, he's organized a series of debates to settle the question of which Dharma his country should follow. Chinese Zen or Indian Madhyamaka, so this is the sort of philosophical school centered around Nagarjuna, the middle way teaching. The topic, whether awakening is sudden or gradual. Speaking for the Zen side is the East Mountain School monk, or the Northern School as it's sometimes called, Heishang Moheyan. In Japanese it's Washo Maka-en. On the Indian side is the renowned scholar of Nagarjuna, Kamalashila. And if you know Tibetan Buddhism at all, Kamalashila is a very important figure in the school. The debates take place over a full 2 years, so there are a series of debates sort of punctuated over this 2-year period. In the end, Kamalashila is declared the winner of what would come to be known as the Council of Lhasa, even though Samye Monastery is some hours away from Lhasa for some reason that acquired that name. Moheyan, the Chinese monk, is told to leave the country, and all texts teaching a sudden awakening position are gathered and allegedly destroyed. The king then commissions Kamalashila to write a text called The Stages of Meditation to make sure the monks of his country don't go astray in the future. So what I'd like to talk about today is this idea of gradual or sudden enlightenment or awakening. So just by show of hands, I'm sort of curious, have you come across this term sudden awakening in reading about Zen? Okay, so almost everyone, that's good. Strangely though, Dogen never uses this term, basically. He uses it 3 times from what Hojo-san and I could find in all of his writing, which is not very much. So the question is sort of, where does Dogen fit in terms of this question of sudden versus gradual, either awakening or cultivation? Sometimes you'll hear the phrase, and I'll talk about it, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, or sudden awakening, sudden cultivation. You get various combinations like this. So to answer this question first, we sort of need to understand, obviously, what is meant by sudden awakening versus gradual awakening. And I wanted to just sort of frame it first with this debate in Tibet, because in Tibetan Buddhism this is a popular story. You don't really hear about it much in East Asian Buddhism. There are some East Asian sources also that talk about this debate. So it seems to have some kind of plausible historicity. And we know actually that Zen influenced Tibetan Buddhism around this time because they found texts translated from Chinese Zen texts into Tibetan. And 2 of the major Tibetan schools have, the Kagyu school and the Nyingma school, have practices that are sort of similar to Zazen in ways. So at any rate, before we even get into that though, I'd like to just sort of talk about the word enlightenment, because we use this word all the time in English. And it's sort of a strange translation. As most of us probably know, the Sanskrit word is bodhi, which means awakening. So how did we end up with this term enlightenment? Because the ideas of awakening and enlightenment, while sort of similar, sort of suggest slightly different things. Like, for example, enlightenment seems kind of instantaneous, right? Like, you turn the light on and the room lights up. But awakening is sort of a gradual process, right? You wake up in the morning and you're kind of groggy, and it takes a little while to sort of get going, so it sort of implies a more gradual thing. So the word enlightenment is a translation for bodhi. Apparently first appeared in 1835 and gained traction when the translator Max Muller, so he was a sort of German-British translator of Sanskrit texts, and had pretty mass appeal. So he published this series of books called Sacred Texts of the East back in the mid-19th century that were quite popular at the time as sort of Buddhist teaching percolated into the kind of Western consciousness. So he favored this translation, Enlightenment, for Bodhi. And interestingly, this seems to be slightly tied up with Muller's own ideas about philosophy. So he was a proponent of what's called the perennial philosophy, which some of you might have heard of, which is sort of the idea that all religions have a kind of common truth at their core. And he used this word enlightenment to kind of denote accessing this single truth that all religions share. And the word also has Christian connotations. So for example, Calvin wrote, "It is God alone who enlightens our mind to perceive his truths." So this word was sort of in use in Protestant Christianity. And then finally, of course, we have the Western, the European Enlightenment kind of philosophy movement in the 17th and 18th century, which is all about kind of reason and science and so forth. So, Buddhism is generally being presented in Europe as a very reasonable religion as opposed to Christianity, which is seen as sort of superstitious. And so kind of by equating Buddhism's kind of central concept with the European Enlightenment, it gives it this sheen of rationality. So, all these things I think influenced why we use the term enlightenment. But, I think literally speaking, it's probably not a very good translation. Hojo-san, I asked Hojo-san about it, and he said that he was fine with it because there are some texts that make kind of metaphorical references to being in a dark room and a light being turned on as sort of a metaphor for awakening, but that's not the most kind of common approach. And also too, in Chinese sort of understandings of Buddhism, dark is associated with kind of the absolute, where there's no dualism and no discrimination. When you're in a dark room, you can't see what's here or what's there. Everything just becomes this sort of flat oneness. So, and I was talking to Hojo-san about it, I said, maybe we should use the term endarkenment instead of enlightenment. And he thought that was funny. But really, maybe we want to do both at the same time, right? Because our practice is always about bringing these two sides of kind of oneness and multiplicity together. So we need to do both, I think. Anyways, translation also, I think, had an effect on East Asian Buddhism, right? Because they don't speak Sanskrit, so they're using their own terms to refer to awakening as well. And the early Chinese translations seem to have usually used the term Do, or what in Japanese would be pronounced Do or Dao, the way, to refer to awakening, which is sort of weird, right? But in Taoism and Confucianism, they speak of the way sort of as their kind of highest truths. So it became kind of a association. So since in Taoism they're sort of seeking the way, and Confucianism seeking its own way, in Buddhism it would make sense that you're sort of seeking this ultimate way in Buddhism, which is awakening. But over time that sort of it stuck around in a few set phrases, like mind of the way is the translation for Bodhi mind. So mind of the way is actually maybe inaccurate, because in some ways, at least when we hear it in English, it gives the wrong impression. But they also used other terms as well. So in Dogen's writing, we see usually three terms, and Hojo-san talks about this frequently. But the three in the Japanese pronunciation are Go, Kaku, and Shō. So Go is like realization, and this is the word that's used in Japanese most often and read as Satori. So it's kind of idea of, Satori gets translated also as enlightenment in English. But the sense is sort of realizing something, like, I suddenly realized, X. Kaku is like more literally like awakening. It's used to wake up. And then Shō is sort of the strangest, and actually Dogen's kind of preferred term usually, although he uses them in slightly different contexts sometimes. So Shō is to verify, or the verification. And this is used in in modern Japanese in legal contexts, so like to witness something or proof of something, this character is used. So it has that sense of sort of confirming some truth. So Dogen really likes this because in Zazen, awakening is already reality itself, right? So in Zazen, we're simply confirming that awakening that's already there. Each of these words also is sort of paired with either an antonym or sort of a related term. So goal realization is paired with mayoi, which is sort of delusion or to be lost. So that's kind of, you have either realized the truth or you're kind of deluded about the truth. Kaku is usually paired with like a dreaming, you're either dreaming or you're awake. And then rather than an antonym, verification is often paired with practice. So, we have this term practice realization in our tradition. And this comes from a phrase that, refers to kind of traditionally referred to the process by which we become awakened, actually. So first we hear the Dharma, then we think about the Dharma, then we practice the Dharma, and then we verify the Dharma. So that sort of 4-character set of hearing, thinking, practicing, verifying is where that pair comes from. Okay, so just now that we've got all the linguistic stuff out of the way, going back to just sort of how awakening is conceived. So in the early tradition, pretty non-controversially, a gradual thing. So, Pali texts and early Chinese texts very clearly have sort of very spelled out programs of practice that you follow that happen over a long period of time, usually multiple lifetimes that you have to do these, where various defilements are removed. So it's sort of this process of purification, right? There's in meditation programs, usually you start with a shamatha practice, which is like increasing your concentration, and that's where the term dhyana, that Zen comes from, is from that idea. So you go up there's the first dhyana where you've removed such and such defilement, the second, the third, the fourth, and so on. And then once you've kind of perfected those concentration practices, you move on to insight practices. So this is what we call Vapasana now. It's Vipasana in Sanskrit, where you're kind of, again, these are paired with removing defilements, so you're gaining insight about sort of the body and mind as you do these practices. So you're going through these kind of programs, so it's a gradual process, and then at the end of this long series of practices, you are supposed to attain awakening. So when Mahayana Buddhism comes along, it sort of changes the basic framing of this a little bit, because the focus is no longer on purification so much, although that does sort of stick around in the Mahayana tradition for a while, and even to today in some traditions, of course. But the focus is more on wisdom, or seeing emptiness, right? And presumably, if you are able to see it, this can happen instantaneously. So this is not to say that you remove all of your defilements necessarily right away, but you can gain insight into emptiness or see emptiness. And for example, in the Rinzai tradition, they have the idea of kensho. You see the mind, sort of see the true nature of things. And this can happen before you've become a great person or anything. You don't necessarily have to go through a long series of practices before you do this. So anyway, that's where kind of this idea of suddenness starts. So if we don't have to purify ourselves, it becomes possible to be suddenly awakened. So yeah, this debate in Tibet that I started with is sort of framed around this, right? So even though the Indian opponent of the Zen practitioner in these debates is also a Mahayana practitioner, in Indian Buddhism they still, taught that you need to go through a sort of gradual process of purification before you can have the sudden insight into emptiness. So they would kind of agree that awakening itself is a sudden thing, but whether or not you need to do these preliminary purification practices was kind of what was at issue. The debate in China goes back further, than this. I started with the year 792, but we sort of first see this term sudden awakening, sudden realization, in the writings of the 4th century Chinese monk Dao Sheng, who's a really important Chinese monk, or Dōsho in Japanese. So people that were writing about him at the time described this sudden realization teaching as a new teaching, so like something that wasn't traditional. And it was apparently quite controversial, like he caught a lot of flack for this. And it was quite related to Daosheng's insistence on the universality of Buddha nature, which was also kind of new at the time. So there were texts in China at that time that suggested that there was a type of being called an Ichantika. So maybe some of you have heard this term. This is someone who can never attain awakening because they just have a certain set of karmic conditions that totally preclude them ever being awakened. And that was kind of the common view at the time. But Daosheng didn't like this idea and thought that even someone who would otherwise be considered an Ichantika could still attain awakening. So he was probably not the first to suggest this, but he was pretty insistent on the idea of the universality of the possibility of awakening. So let's see. So why did this become kind of more popular in China rather than in India? So it seems that in Indian Buddhism, obviously, as we saw in the debate, this gradual practice of purification stuck around and then was kind of absorbed into Tibetan Buddhism as well, where in most traditions, there's still kind of a set program of practices. They don't, unlike us, where we just say, oh, here, you're doing the Buddhist practice right now, go for it. They send you on a program where you have to sort of figure things out first. So there are a couple of kind of things that we might point to that might help us explain why this became the sort of standard view in China eventually. So one thing is that samadhi, so that is like meditation, became equated with prajna, or wisdom. So normally you do samadhi in order to attain wisdom, right? You do meditation so that you can get wisdom. But there was in the Avatamsaka tradition, so this is this, well, I don't want to talk about the whole text, but one of the Chinese schools basically, based on this Buddha Sutra, came up with this idea of the unity of cause and effect. So if there's sort of a set cause and effect, then the effect is already included in the cause. And this gets taken up by Dogen in a big way, right? Because if practice and awakening are one, that's also speaking to this idea of the unity of cause and effect. So let me see here, there's a quotation that I want to read from one of the Avatamsaka school practitioners in China. Sorry, before that actually. So this is actually from the Platform Sutra that I want to read from. So there's this, speaking of the unity of samadhi, or meditation, and wisdom. So, good friends, how then are meditation and wisdom alike? They are like the lamp and the light it gives forth. If there is a lamp, there is light. If there is no lamp, there is no light. The lamp is the substance of the light is the function of the lamp. Thus, although they have two names, in substance they are not two. Meditation and wisdom are also like this. So that's one instance where we see this unity of the cause and effect. And then in the case of the Avatamsaka school, so Fa Xiang, who's one of the kind of famous guys in that tradition, so he wrote, because of the wonderful principle of dependent origination, prior and subsequent are all the same. If the prior is obtained, the subsequent is attained. When the end is finished, then one penetrates to the bottom of the beginning. I think that's a really interesting idea. When the end is finished, then one penetrates to the bottom of the beginning. So in Dogen's teaching, we see this all over the place, right? So not just in the unity of practice and awakening, or practice and verification is actually the term he uses, but also in various other fascicles that he writes. So when he talks about becoming a monk, so shukke, leaving home, he equates leaving home with awakening. So once you've decided to take that vow to become a monk, awakening is already there. Also, in Zui Monkey, which we read in the morning, all the time, he's saying, once you've aroused Bodhi mind, awakening is already there. So from this very beginning, the end is already included. Okay, so that's kind of one factor. Next, Buddha nature. So, we already sort of talked about this a little bit with Daosheng, but the idea of Buddha nature, right, is that we all already sort of have some, in Dogen's conception, reality itself is Buddha nature. So we're already living in it. We ourselves and everything that we see and interact with in our lives are Buddha nature or awakening. In other conceptions, this might be something more like a seed that we have to nurture through practice, but still everyone has it. So in that sense, we can kind of suddenly, access this Buddha nature that we have inside of us. So sudden realization is possible there. The third factor that might have made sudden realization more popular in China might have had to do with some Taoist assumptions about the world in China that are obviously absent in India. So in Taoism, you often have this idea of kind of the interpenetration of the absolute and the relative already there. So in Taoist texts, you hear stuff about like the root and the branches. So the root is sort of the ground from which all reality, or sort of, the myriad things in the world arise, and there's this sort of one root. So you get metaphors like that in the early Taoist tradition. And so again, if all of these, the particular is tied in with the absolute, then again, we have this possibility of gaining sudden insight into that fact. It doesn't necessarily require any purification to see that. And then finally, when I talked to Hojo-san, he mentioned this text, The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, which is a really important Chinese treatise. And this is the text sort of where we first see this articulation of original enlightenment or original awakening. In this case, it is awakening, it's honkaku, so like root awakening. And the idea in this text is we have original awakening, but the winds of ignorance affect our mind, and we're separated from it. So in this metaphor, the ocean is original awakening. The winds of ignorance cause waves on that surface, so we feel separated from the ocean because we're up on the crest of the wave. But really, of course, the wave is still intimately tied to the ocean. It's not separate from it. So in this text, we have to undergo a sort of process of returning to that original awakening, and this is called Shikaku. And this happens through the process of removing ignorance, right? So this can be seen as a gradual process, but also, the Chinese monks reading this text also said, well, if you had really good faculties or really good karma, you could kind of suddenly gain insight into this original awakening. You wouldn't necessarily need to go through any long process. So, at any rate, not so long after Daosheng sort of first seemed to introduce this idea, it became sort of the standard view in China, and we get a lot of criticism of gradualist doctrines. So we see this a lot in our tradition. Probably most famously in the poetry competition between Huineng and Shen Shui. So this is the sixth ancestor, his kind of story that many of you have probably heard before. But Shen Shu, who's supposed to be the star disciple of this particular monastery, writes a poem on the wall, and the poem is, "The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is like a bright mirror's stand. At all times we must strive to polish it and must not let dust collect." So these last two lines, polishing it and not letting dust collect, suggest this kind of gradual process, right? We need to polish ourselves over time, remove defilements. And Huineng's poem in response to this is Bodhi originally has no tree. The bright mirror also has no stand. Fundamentally, there is not a single thing. Where could dust arise? So, in the text where we see this poem, Huineng's verse is praised as sort of a sudden teaching because it's not about a process, it's about sort of sudden insight into this fact of emptiness. Whereas Shen Shu is, giving this metaphor of sort of gradually polishing a mirror. So later on, a little bit after this, there was another famous Chinese monk named Zongmi, and also later Qi Nul, who was a very famous Korean Zen practitioner. They both advocated this idea of sudden realization, gradual cultivation. And in this system, I'll just read Zongmi's quotation here. It is only because of variations in the style of the world-honored one's expositions, so the world-honored one is the Buddha, of the teachings, that there are sudden expositions in accordance with the truth and gradual expositions in accordance with the capacities of beings. This does not mean that there is a separate sudden and gradual teaching. So here he's saying that these actually aren't different things. They're the same, and they're just sort of confused because different terminology is used. In terms of the elimination of hindrances, it is like when the sun immediately comes out. So that's the sudden awakening. Yet the frost melts gradually. So we get the sun coming out instantly, but then it takes a little while for the frost to melt away, for the defilements to melt away. With respect to the perfection of virtue, it is like a child, which, when born, immediately possesses 4 limbs and 6 senses. As it grows, it gradually develops control over its actions. Therefore, the Avatamsaka Sutra says that when the bodhicitta is first aroused, so the mind of awakening is first aroused, this is already the accomplishment of perfect enlightenment. So again, we're going back here to the equation of cause and effect. And again, Dogen uses this idea a lot. Okay, so that's kind of a crash course in sudden realization, how we got that idea. Now, what about Dogen? Does Dogen fit into this scheme or not? So, like I said, he only uses the term about 3 times. So he doesn't seem to have been very fond of it, even though he surely, would have known what this meant. And yeah, there's no reason to think that it was out of ignorance or something that he didn't use this term. So it must have been for some particular reason. So what are some of the sort of basic assumptions of Dogen that we might look at for why he wouldn't favor this framework? So first, the most kind of basic hallmark of Dogen's teaching is a radical non-dualism, right? So in the Shobogenzo, he's always kind of taking pairs and then breaking them down, because he's always saying, we have A and we have B, but really, these are kind of the same thing. They're deeply interconnected. So he's always kind of going back to this idea of Indra's net, right, of interconnection, which Hojo-san, that's why he always is drawing this on the board, right? Because there's no break really between the absolute and the relative. We use these terms, but they're the same thing. It's like, he says 5 fingers versus 1 hand. So they're kind of pointing to the same thing in reality, but we use different terminology to do it. And of course, again, this is especially true in the case of practice and awakening, right? So we think in our common sense mind that these are 2 different things, right? We practice in order to attain awakening, but Dogen says no, there's no difference between practice and awakening. And this, comes from Bendowa, which, if you haven't read that text, I'd highly recommend it. It's very readable compared to some of the Shobogenzo texts, and there's a commentary also by Uchiyama Roshi in this book, The Wholehearted Way. So if you want to explore Bendowa, I would definitely recommend this. So here is what Dogen says in this text. To think that practice and enlightenment are not identical is a non-Buddhist view. So that might be a little extreme, but that is his view. In the Buddha Dharma, practice and realization are one. Because your practice right now is practice based on realization, The training of the beginner is the totality of intrinsic realization. Intrinsic realization is like, original awakening. So the training of the beginner is the totality of intrinsic realization. So that's why we say in our tradition, as soon as you do Zazen for the first time, you're doing the Buddha's Zazen. There's no difference of what you're doing versus what the Buddha was doing. Therefore, even though you are instructed to practice, do not think that there is any attainment outside of practice itself, because practice must be considered to point directly to intrinsic realization. Because realization is already realization based on practice, the realization is boundless. If practice is practice based on realization, practice has no beginning. In this way, Shakyamuni and Mahakāshyapa, Mahakāshyapa is the first disciple, or sort of the first inheritor of the Buddha's Dharma and the Zen tradition, both practiced the practice of realization daily, and Bodhidharma and Huineng are likewise drawn to practice based on enlightenment. So Bodhidharma, of course, is the transmitter of Zen, and Huineng is the famous sixth ancestor who I was just reading about. All the examples of the ancestors are similar. Since there is no practice apart from attainment, we are fortunate in directly transmitting a portion of wonderful practice, and therefore even the beginner's negotiation of the way is the acquisition of one portion of intrinsic enlightenment. Dogen he doesn't use, so that's kind of his famous framing of this idea that practice and realization are one. So we like to use that phrase a lot. It only shows up in Bendowa here, but he, throughout the Shobogenzo was using various other kind of metaphors and stuff to say the same thing. Okay, so at any rate, given this idea, if delusion and awakening are fully penetrated, right? Because when we sit in Zazen, delusion is there, right? We have dumb thoughts coming up in our mind all the time. But we're not engaging with them. We open the hand of thought and just sort of let them go without grasping them or identifying them with the self. So delusion and realization are both present. So if these two things are fully interpenetrated, and delusion can't exist without awakening and vice versa, in this framework, sudden versus gradual really doesn't make any sense, right? What is sudden or gradual about the true reality of all beings? It's always been this way and it always will be this way. So there's nothing sudden or gradual about it, because that implies that there has to be some switch going off at some point. But for Dogen, this is just true reality always, and whether or not we're actualizing it, it's always there. Second point is that the basis of Dogen's understanding of Buddhism is from the Lotus Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra sort of predates this debate between sudden and gradual awakening, so he might not have cared about it that much, given his kind of general focus on the Lotus Sutra. Hojo-san suggested that to me. Third, just sort of getting back to what I was just talking about time, we know that Dogen, and again Hojo-san talks about this as well, had sort of three ways of understanding time. So there's the conventional view of time, which progresses from the past through the present into the future, right? And we're kind of moving along in a particular trajectory. We can't go backwards, we're always going forward. That's the conventional view of time, right? So he accepts that as sort of the conventional reality, but he also says that there's just this moment, just this one moment, and it's just now, just now, just now. And if you think of a point in geometry, right, that point has no, it's just a position, it doesn't fill any space, right? So in the same way, this present moment is like that. There's no beginning or end, so therefore it can't be gradual or sudden, because both of those assume already that you're moving along a progression of time. So if you get rid of that idea, then what does sudden and gradual mean? And also the third view of time in Dogen's teaching is the totality of all time is tied into this moment. So you can also view all of the past, the present, and the future as being contained within the present moment. Also in this view, if we just have one big block of eternal time, there's also no gradual or sudden, because it's just one kind of static block, essentially. So, let's see. I'm going to read a little passage related to this sort of from Shobogenzo Sesshin Sessho. So Dogen writes here, as for the Buddha way, when one first arouses the thought of enlightenment, it is enlightenment. When one achieves perfect enlightenment, it is enlightenment. First, last, and in between are all enlightenment. So there we get this view of the big block of time. The foolish think that at the time one is studying the way, one does not attain enlightenment, but that only when one has acquired satori is it enlightenment. They do not understand that when one musters one's entire mind and body and practices the Buddha way, this is the entirety of the Buddha way. So, he says that the conventional view of time is mistaken. We have to look at this kind of bigger perspective, and in that context, awakening is fully contained here. Notice too, though, this is one of the things that I've really struggled with Dogen. And, so he says, when one first arouses the thought of enlightenment, it is enlightenment. When one achieves perfect enlightenment, it is enlightenment. So he still sort of seems to hold on to this idea of a possibility of totally removing defilements. And here he seems to denote that as perfect enlightenment, like a Buddha's enlightenment, which is sort of slightly different than the awakening that we experience in Zazen. But both of these, being, again, tied through the result of, or cause and effect, are both there. So he seems to sort of hold both of these things together. So there's kind of the verification that we do in Zazen, but there is also this sort of gradual, process, moment by moment, where through the insight that we gain in Zazen, we're kind of purifying the body as well over time. And in Zuimonki also, he obviously is placing emphasis on people's behavior and stuff like that. It's not just, we do Zazen, we, see or verify awakening there, and then we go back to being deluded schlubs, outside of practice. He still suggests that we have to use this verification of the inherent awakening in the world to perfect ourselves over time. But we do that moment by moment. Sort of fourth point here, again, Dogen tends to reject dualistic distinctions like Hongaku and Shikaku, so these terms that I talked about from the Awakening of Faith, so original awakening versus sort of attaining awakening. Buddhas and ordinary beings, practice and awakening, even real and illusory, so there's the famous text Gabyo, which is about painted rice cakes. So there's some text that compares delusion to a painted rice cake rather than a real rice cake, so you can't eat it. So if you think the painted rice cake is the real thing, then you're deluded. But Dogen says no, it's still a real it's a real painting of a thing, and the truth is included there as well. So even in delusion, awakening is included. So he breaks down even distinctions like real versus illusory. So we see this, I think, in some of the usages, so some of the three usages where Dogen uses these terms, sudden and gradual. So here's one of Dogen's three usages of these terms. So this is from one of the formal talks that he would have done. So he holds up his whisk and said, "Look, look, the halfway and the fulfilled of provisional and genuine teachings, the partial and complete of gradual and sudden, the 3,000 great parables and 800 small parables, the boundless ocean of meaning and the inexhaustible Dharma gates, they all exist on the tip of Eihei's whisk." So he's, always doing this, right? Taking two things and, saying, no, it's just actual reality. Like, don't get caught up in the terminology and the dualism. Really what we're talking about is reality right here, right now, the whisk that I'm holding up. So he does that with sudden and gradual in this case. Another instance where we see him use the term, so this is so Bendowa, at the end of Bendowa, there's a question and answer where Dogen made up sort of a fake questioner and shoots him down every time. So the question here is, relying on either the correct transmitting of the wondrous method of Tathagatas, that is Buddhas, or following the tracks of the ancestral teachers is truly beyond our ordinary thinking. However, reading sutras or chanting the Nembutsu naturally can become a cause of satori. Like, so over time you'll be reborn in a pure land, and there you can attain awakening. So it can become a cause of satori. How can just sitting vainly without doing anything be a means for attaining enlightenment? So in responding to this question, I won't read the whole thing, but he said, furthermore, do you really know the virtue to be gained by working at such practices as reading sutras or chanting Nembutsu? The notion that merely making sounds by moving your tongue leads to the virtue of the Buddha work is completely meaningless. It is extremely far, tremendously distant from resembling Buddha Dharma. So he wasn't a big fan of chanting, it seems. Also, as for opening the sutras, if you clearly understand what Buddha has taught as the principle of sudden and gradual practice, and practice in accord with that teaching, you will certainly accomplish awakening. So, if you clearly understand what Buddha has taught as the principle of sudden and gradual practice. So, it's interesting that he uses both of those terms together. He doesn't differentiate them. He says that the Buddhist practice is both sudden and gradual, and we're practicing them together. So again, this is what he's always doing, is taking two seemingly disparate things and saying, no, they're actually one thing that we have to do together at the same time. And the other usage, I won't read, but he basically just says that, when the Buddha was awakened under the Bodhi tree, he refers to it as a sudden awakening. So it seems like a more kind of generic usage there. Okay, how am I doing on time here? I think it's probably time to wrap up. Let me just look at the conclusion here. Where am I? Okay, so much of this I have cribbed from a paper that's called Enlightenment in Dogen's Zen by Francis Cook, who was a student of Maizumi Roshi, but also a university professor. And in conclusion, so then, this should be sort of obvious right now that we would say that sudden and gradual don't really fit in Dogen's teaching. He didn't use those words for a reason, and we shouldn't try to, necessarily like squeeze him into that framework of sudden and gradual. So Francis Cook says, while there is a gradualist tinge to realization, that idea that, we do need to sort of take the insight of Zazen and apply it to ourselves over time, the absolute nowness of realization seems to preclude categorizing it as either gradual or sudden. And in addition, just find this real fast. So he says, Francis Cook says, for want of a better term, let us call Dogen's view of awakening one of suddenly, suddenly, suddenly. So moment by moment, suddenly, 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 suddenly. Or perhaps suddenly time after time. It is unique to Dogen, he says. So if we have to, say one or the other, we could say it's sort of sudden moment by moment. But really these terms don't work well in the context of Dogen's teaching. So practically, this is, I think, a very abstract talk, and I apologize for that. But I did, always have this question of where does Dogen fit in on this sudden awakening thing that we're always reading about. So I was happy to find this paper that addresses it, and also to discuss it with Hojo-san. And Hojo-san's, when I asked him, his immediate reaction was, that framework doesn't work for Dogen. That was like his instant response. And he said scholars have been trying to do it for, decades and decades, and it doesn't make sense. So I think, though, what we need to take away from this is just sort of a reinforcement of this idea that practice and awakening are one in our teaching. We're not trying to get any special sudden psychological insight in this particular practice. We're not trying to gain some goal at the end of a gradual process. That might be there. Maybe if we practice, if we're lucky enough to be reborn as monks in our next lifetime, and we can continue purifying ourselves, maybe we'll get a taste of that Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, that complete, perfect awakening at the end of it all. But that's not what we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on, this moment right here, right now. And I read, so there's a new Kodo Sawaki book that came out called To You, which if you're interested in Kodo Sawaki, I would check that out. But he had this phrase that I liked, where he said, trying to get satori, or awakening, by doing zazen is like getting up on a train and being in such a hurry that you start running up and down the train. So you're already on the train when you're doing zazen, so you can just sit and relax in zazen. You don't need to get up and run to the front of the train. So I like that. So I think I'll end it there, and if anyone has any questions or thoughts, please go ahead. So thank you.
Well, I'm behind you, so you can't see me, so I'm just going to talk. I think the content that you're sharing with us today really sits in the intersection to me of what Dogen was trying to do. Because when he comes back from China, he's got two things he's trying to do. One is he's trying to bring the doctrines that he learned in China, which, you pointed out, he's immersed in this stuff. He spent 4 years in China with his teacher and really thought that was really an important time for him. And so he was like taking all this in. So one of his jobs in his mind is, I need to bring these doctrines, back to Japan. The other thing he's trying to bring back is the Chinese monastic institution. Because he says we need a container for this stuff. So we see this, sometimes it feels like a creative tension between awakening is already here from the doctrinal side, and golly, all of his instructions about how we practice on a moment-by-moment basis. So I think all the things that you're talking about really sit in that intersection. It's like, why are we practicing? So he's constantly, when he's talking like in the Bendo Wa, one of the challenges he really had was that he inherited or adopted various practitioners from other schools.
Right.
And he kind of had to help them unlearn the things that they thought they knew. So some of the things that he seems to emphasize for us today, we look at that and go, oh, it means he thinks we should never do X and Y, when of course what he's saying is, don't do that primarily. He's trying to help people unlearn stuff. So there's all of these things in this intersection kind of going on, right? So it was really interesting just to put what you were talking about against the larger backdrop of the doctrinal piece, the Chinese monastic institution, and how these things are really developing at the time that he's writing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, for me, what you were providing was another interesting aspect of that whole thing. Mm-hmm. So I appreciated hearing from you today.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, Dogen, if you look at his monastic regulation texts, he has this sort of seemingly odd insistence on exactly what you're supposed to be doing at any moment of the day, which, if we're already in awakened reality, then, does it really matter, what we're doing at any given time? But, it's always, Dogen always brings it back to this verifying piece, right? So when I was talking with Hojo-san, he kept emphasizing this idea that for Dogen, nothing is hidden, right? Mm-hmm. So in some of the other Zen notions, we have Buddha nature, but it's hidden away from us, and we have to find it and kind of pull it out. And Dogen didn't like this idea because, again, it creates a dualism, that we're not already here in awakened reality. And so I asked Hojo-san, I was like, well, have you heard of the expression "hidden in plain sight"? And he was like, oh no, I haven't heard that. And I was like, well, it's like if you wearing your glasses on your head and you're looking around your room trying to find your glasses, and then you kind of realize that they were there all along. And he said, oh yeah, I like that. It's like that. So that's sort of what verifying is. It's not that we're separate from our glasses, they're right there on our head, but we need to, bring to mind that they're there. And so Dogen's insistence on all these, focusing on what we're doing is this constant process of verification, either, through Zazen practice or, our daily attention to the fact that we're right here in this moment right now. So yeah, I think and he had all these students from this school, the Nihon Darumashu, who were basically taught that because of original awakening, you can be a total jerk, and you've still already got awakening. You just have to kind of know that you have it. And Dogen obviously didn't like this because that ignores the verification aspect. There's no verification if you're just sitting around drinking beer, eating pizza, and saying, "Oh, this is my original awakening." I mean, it is there. It's there, but you're not engaging with it. You're not verifying it. So yeah, thank you for that. Anything else?
Hey Doju, this is Fusats Online. I really, again, thank you for your teaching. You always bring things back around and, give us something, leave us something to sit with. But for me, one of the things that arose for me is going back to some of my Tibetan lineages is initially when I first started studying, they say, oh, there's different ways of mind training, and then every level, there's another level and another level. But then, the further I got and the longer I studied, you realize that you were given everything from the beginning. And I think, it's interesting how that evolved through the practice. Whereas, when I'm, as I'm studying and practicing Zen, it's all up front, it's right here, there's nothing hidden, there's nothing that you have to go through, there's no level, this is just all there is. So I really appreciated that line of what you were saying, underlying everything that you were saying and speaking about, and always bringing it back to, again, how Dogen viewed that and kind of what really is it that we are to do, and it's just a practice. So I really appreciate the contrasts that I hear, but it's always coming back to the oneness and the same. So I was just sitting here cracking up, as I was thinking about as you were talking about the Tibetans and how they are debating and and who won and who didn't. It's coming back to the same thing. So I appreciate that underlying truth that you were speaking in your talk. So thank you for your teaching again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a friend who practiced in the Kagyu tradition for a long time, and he said that I can't remember what it's called, but I guess you get this sort of kind of intimate disclosure of what sort of the true teaching is after practicing for some time, and the basic idea was something like, oh yeah, you already had it from the beginning. You've been doing all this stuff, but nothing's actually changed, and it's been there all along. So I think that might speak to this fact that Tibet is caught between the East Asian Buddhist world and the Indian Buddhist world, and there was crossover between the two. And I think it seems maybe in the Kagyu tradition more than others, there's sort of a Zen aspect to it. So. Yeah, thank you.
Who was the decider?
The king, Trisong Detsen. I mean, this is a legendary story, so who knows? But yeah, that's how the story goes. I think there was some story I first learned about this when I was a teaching assistant for the Introduction to Buddhism class at IU, and I want to say that the professor said that there was some intrigue about the Chinese monk being close with the king's wife or something. I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. Anything else this morning? Yeah.
If you can be patient with me formulating this, I have been pouring through some Dogen lately, and there's a famous poem he has, and it starts out something like, in the spring, beautiful flowers, it goes on and on, and then at the end it says something like, when useless things do not hang in your mind, all seasons are beautiful, or whatever. And there's that section there, when all things do not hang in the mind, there's a translation of the word. That's the translation. From the Japanese, I think the word is Suzushai. It's one word that takes up the whole phrase, in other words. And so I've been struggling with what does that really mean, and maybe you can talk to them, maybe you can't, maybe I've got the word wrong, maybe I need to come with you with better information.
Yeah, I mean, I that doesn't immediately sound familiar to me, that word, but that may just be because I don't know it. There are lots of Japanese words that I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think that, again, that speaks to this idea of moment by moment verification, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be intimate with the seasons for them to be beautiful. If we're just walking by, thinking of whatever our daily concerns are, we're not going to notice the flowers on the trees, the snow on the ground, the verdant summer foliage. So, I mean, I think that is probably the basic idea. But yeah, maybe if you can show me the text.
I'd like to see what you think, what Hojo-san, what Hoko thinks of what this word means, how it translates that way, because I don't think it's quite the same. I don't think it has the same, like so many things that you try and translate from an Orient way of thinking into an Occidental way of thinking, and it's just doesn't do it.
Yeah, there are always difficulties with translation. And I think, speaking to that point, it's interesting how much of this tradition that we have, our Zen tradition, is kind of the result of translation choices. There's the fascicle of Shobogenzo, true reality of all beings, and Hojo-san really likes this phrase and says that that's kind of the proper frame in which to understand Dogen, right? Is that we, all beings, so the myriad things, and true reality, sort of this oneness, are together there in the true reality of all beings. But this phrase, Shoho Jiso, comes from Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra, and it ain't there at all in the original Sanskrit. It's just a total kind of invention of the translator, and yet, it became very important in our tradition. So.
Right.
As long as I think the person has kind of the right idea, the words are a little flexible maybe. So, but yeah, we'll take a look at it. Thank you.
I was trying to quickly find it here since I actually have a tablet.
Is it one of the Waka poems, or?
I think, it's a Waka. I recently encountered it with Steve Hines' new book.
Ah, okay.
And it is a little different than what I remember originally. And so when I was seeing it in the Japanese, and then I saw that phrase there, of course it's all like this big, and then the English is this big, and how does that become that?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Hojo-san's manuscript, for the book that we've been working on, has the original Japanese for all of the Waka poems, so I can find it in there. We have a publication date, by the way, for that book. It's June 15th, I think.
Oh, cool.
They kept pushing it back because of various supply line disruptions and a lack of paper and a lack of printers and so forth. But anyway, that'll be the Shobogen, new translation of the Shobogenzo Zui Monkey, plus all of his Waka poetry with commentary.
Oh, that should be good.
Cool.
Anything else before we wrap up today?
Sawyer has something.
Oh, yeah, Sawyer, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sasatsu. Jumping in from Zoom World today. I am interested in your thoughts on how to situate these teachings of gradual and sudden and practice and awakening are one. In a context of relating with others, in that you can sort of think of it in your own zazen and your own kind of idea of your own awakening, whether it's sudden or not. I'm thinking of a phrase in the Bodhisattva Shishobo. So when Dogen is talking about sort of being bodhisattva action, and he's says the mind of a sentient being is difficult to change. And that feels to me like the understatement of a lifetime. And so that question of when we're relating with others, it's part of our practice to sort of be involved in their own transformation as well as our own, and whether that is gradual or sudden, or whether there's even any need of transformation in how we relate with other people or other beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a difficult question, but a good one. So first, I mean, I'd say that, you mentioned one's own awakening. And this is another thing that struck me from the new Sawaki Roshi book, is, he emphasizes that awakening is not yours. Awakening is reality, right? So it's not something that you can possess at all. So, all we're doing is sort of actualizing this reality of awakening that is already here. So I think if we take that as a framework, that gives us, if we really take that to heart, that gives us some special skills, I think, for interacting with other people. Because usually when we're trying to convince someone of something, it's like my ego against their ego, right? Like, I've got the right view, you've got the wrong view, and I need to, make sure that you take my view. But what the awakened reality of all beings kind of tells us is, that person, even though, we may not condone necessarily their opinions, we do have to sort of accept them as the true reality in which we're living in, and meet them on that level. And I think once we do that, once we sort of understand that anyone says is the product of, ancient twisted karma that, we can't easily just untie in one conversation. When we have kind of deep insight into that fact, we can have compassion for, what they're saying and how they're saying it in a way that we can't if we're just sort of putting our ego up against theirs. So, even if we do that, we're unlikely to convince someone of something, in a second, but I think you're much less likely to create an adversarial situation, which, immediately is going to make your interlocutor defensive and probably, reinforce their own opinions because they feel attacked. So, I think that insight into, the true reality of all beings is really important for interactions with other people. It may not solve our problems in any kind of rapid way, but it still makes the interaction better for everyone involved. So I don't know if that is very helpful or not, but that's what came to mind for me. All right, anything else before we wrap up?
Maybe quickly, something you said in passing, and I thought this was helpful, was, when we're doing Zazen, there's no particular, psychological experience we're looking for.
Right.
There's not a, big, in your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, at least logically, that would imply that any psychological experience you're having Zazen is Zazen, it's awakening.
Mm-hmm.
But, at least to me, that rubs against a little bit the, letting go of thought and trying to prune certain experiences that you might be having.
Mm-hmm.
If anything comes to mind for you,
Yeah. So I think that, and since you've done sesshin here, you've probably experienced this. I think the idea is the kind of non-engagement with the things that arise in our mind. So I think that especially during sesshin, you find your mind just kind of constantly trying to grab your attention, right? And that, the longer you do sesshin, it feels like the weirder and weirder thoughts you start to have. But at a certain point, all these thoughts are coming and going, but you're really just not engaging with them. You're not even really having to try to open the hand of thought because your sort of body and mind have become kind of tired or something through the sesshin process. So I mean, I think that is what our tradition, and especially maybe in this lineage, Uchiyama Roshi and Sawaki Roshi are sort of pointing to when they say opening the hand of thought. So I think that when we engage with a particular psychological state, of course awakening is still there. We have to accept this, complete interpenetration of delusion and awakening. But at that, when we're grasping thoughts, that's not verifying, So again, we come back to this idea of verifying. So we verify by opening the hand of thought and just seeing emptiness right there. So I don't know if that helps to answer the question. So they're kind of both there, and it sort of depends on our non-engagement with them to do the verification part. But it's always there. It's not hidden, right?
Sure.
So.
Helps distinguish a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So anything else, or should we wrap up?
I found his poem, but I don't have the Japanese. In spring, hundreds of flowers. In autumn, the clear moon. In summer, a cool breeze. And in winter, the white snow. If your mind is free of vanity, then every season is fine.
I don't think I like this one.
Is it the vanity part?
Yeah.
Free of vanity. So I guess we need to figure that out.
You can have other crap going on, but if it's free of vanity.
All right.